This old guy DIY video has to do with installing a Volquartsen hammer and extractor in a Remington model 597 22 Winchester Magnum rimfire. So this gun has proved to be very accurate and effective, but sometimes it does not eject the shells as it should. So after reading online, I concluded this is the answer, and I was able to get the hammer and the extractor for $52. So I bought both, and although I don't feel like I have a problem with trigger pull, it feels fine to me, I thought I'd replace them both. The first step is to confirm that the gun is empty, and then remove these two screws that hold the stock to the rest of the gun. Once the stock is removed, just push out this little assembly pin, and that'll allow the trigger assembly to pull away from the receiver. Now with the trigger assembly away from the receiver, we can see the hammer, and I'll be replacing that in just a moment. To replace the hammer, you just push out this pin right here, and that'll allow the hammer and spring to be removed from the assembly. I found it's easier to push the pin out if you let the hammer up, and so it relieves the tension on the spring. Then I just push the pin out from the right side to the left side. When you remove the hammer and the spring, you'll find that there are little plastic bushings that slide into the spring on each side. So in my case, when I pulled the pin out, the bushings fell out, but I'll reinstall those in a moment. To make reassembly of the hammer assembly easier, I just took a round toothpick and I snipped the ends off to make a slave pin. And then after I put the new hammer in, I'll stick this pin in through the bushings and the spring and the bushing on the other side. And then I'll be able to position this whole assembly into the trigger assembly and put it back together. So it's very easy to put the new hammer in. I have the new hammer here. I can just lay it beside the old one. I'll move that spring over, put the bushings in, and then the slave pin. And this is what my little assembly looks like with the pin in through the plastic bushing before I put it back into the housing. I did this as a two-step process. I took this little Allen wrench and I pushed it through from the right side, and I pushed my little assembly aid slave pin out. And now I'll take this pin and insert it in through this left side, and my trigger assembly should be reassembled. So the pin is back in place. The new hammer is installed. And when we pull it back, it locks as it should. And when I let go of the trigger, it comes up. So now it's time to move on to the extractor. So to get to the extractor, we have to remove this bolt. And to get the bolt out, we have to take these two guide rods and the springs out. So the first step there is to come to the back of the receiver and just use the proper size Allen wrench to remove these two small threaded screws. So the screws are out. That's what they look like. And now I'm just going to take the handle, push back on it, and you can see the rods come out. I'll grab the rods one at a time and remove them. And when removing the rod here, I hold my hand inside to hold that spring down just so it doesn't escape. And what I found when I pulled the first one out is basically it's a spring inside a spring. So now we'll pull this second one out. So at this point I just grabbed a hold of the charging handle, pulled that out, and now I can just lift the block right out of the receiver. So when I'm working on small parts that I know have captured springs, I tend to work in one of these little plastic tubs or a cardboard box. So if the spring goes flying, it's contained and I can find it. In this case, it didn't fly away. But what I found for the most effective way to get this little guy out was to take my thumb and I pulled it to the outside over here, and then I have this little Allen wrench, and I just took the little Allen wrench and I pushed in right down here. So basically I was pushing, let's see here. I was pushing on this little area here, and that allowed it to break free. So now I'm going to use the reverse process and grab the new extractor and just put it in place. So with the new extractor, I'm just going to put it down here, and I'm going to lean it out, push it down, and then hope that it snaps in. Here's a picture of the new extractor on the left and the old extractor. And now I'll have somebody come and hold the camera while I try to install this. So in my left hand I have the extractor, in the right hand I have this little tiny Allen wrench. Take the extractor, push it in there, try to keep tension on it, push down with the Allen wrench. I know it's tough to see in the camera, it's tough to see in real life. And there it is, it's popped in place. So the extractor is in, ready to do its job. I've never had this gun apart before, so as I go to put it back together, I cleaned up the block with a rag and some rem oil, the same thing for the guide rods, and now I'll reassemble it. When you put this thing back together, you'll see that the springs slide right into the block here. So I'm putting the springs into the block first, then I'm going to drop the block into the receiver, and then I'll compress the spring with my left hand and put the guide rod in with my right hand. After 3 tries, the technique I found that seems to work is to start the rods so the springs are on the rods, and then on the front end, insert the springs into the retaining area in the block, and then carefully tuck the block into the receiver, and it all pulls together. Now I have the springs onto the guide rods and the block is almost in, so I'll work the block back a little bit and then see if I can take the guide rods home. Dexterity is not a strong suit of mine, so this was frustrating. It took about 15 minutes, but I have the springs back in and functions as it should. I put the 2 set screws in the back here. And from everything I read, we just want those to be snug. There's a recess up here in the front of the block that the guide rod is set into. So all those set screws do is keep the rod from actually moving. And if you go too tight, you can bend it based on what I read. But this thing is trapped by the stock once it's in there, and there's no force that's going to cause the thing to screw out anyway. So we should be good to go. Now it's time to just put the trigger assembly back in. Now it's a pretty tight fit between these springs and the guide rods, so I just shot some rem oil in there, both behind the trigger block, the firing pin block, and the up in front also, so I just tried to lubricate it a little bit. And when reinstalling the trigger assembly, I found it drops in nicely if you just push back a little bit here on the charging handle, then it'll fall right into place. Once the trigger assembly is in place, it's just a matter of replacing this one pin and then putting the receiver assembly back into the stock with 2 screws, and we're done. So the trigger assembly and receiver are back together. Now we'll install it back into the stock. I replaced these 2 screws to mount the receiver and barrel assembly to the stock. So now the gun is back together and ready to go battle the woodchucks. Have a great day. I just took 3 shots to verify function, and the trigger felt great and the shells ejected as they should. So I'm looking forward to another 20 years of using this gun. Have a great day.